the idea
Um,
is that it's a what I was tasked with doing and what I was asked to do was kind of do a comparison between standing up fencing and sitting down fencing, or between FIE fencing and what was IWAS, but now is just WAS fencing. And so the idea behind this presentation is it's not going to be the full 2 hours, it's only going to be an hour at very best. And we're going to kind of go through some of the main differences between, well, what we traditionally assume is fencing refereeing, which we've all done in various competitions, and what wheelchair fencing refereeing involves and what the differences are. There are a few different slides, a few different things to have a look at. Hopefully, we'll cover most of the bases, but remember, not what we're not trying to do is kind of suddenly train everyone to be a wheelchair fencing referee straight out the get-go. What we're trying to do is give people a bit of a general introduction into what the differences between standing up and sitting down fencing are, and how you can use those as a springboard, a jump-off point for anyone that wants to take it up as a secondary refereeing skill set. So hopefully you can all see my screen, and this is what we're going to go through tonight. We're going to go through a little bit on athlete classification, what the difference between different classes are, and what a wheelchair fencing competition looks like. We're going to go through what I would call competition equipment, and by that what I mean is what's different between a wheelchair fencing event and a standard fencing event. We're going to talk about the fences equipment and what the fences have to be that's slightly different because the fences equipment is a little bit different. We're going to talk a little bit about setting the distance between the fences, which is a real critical part of wheelchair fencing. We'll touch a little bit on refereeing in general, hand signals, things like that, what the differences are. We'll talk a little bit about penalties, simply because the penalties in wheelchair fencing are a little bit different. And then we'll talk about side judges, because even though for FIE referees you do occasionally see side judges on the piece, especially at finals and things, in reality it's rare that you see them do anything. In wheelchair fencing, the side judges are really important, and we'll hit on that quite a bit because that's important for our knowledge. And finally, we'll just talk a little bit, just for a minute or so, about medical breaks and what the differences between FIE and para fencing medical breaks are. So fingers crossed, all that'll take us best part of an hour. We'll get through some of the slides relatively quickly. Some of them will take a little bit longer. I would say to the crowd that's in front of me, if you do have any questions, please ask them as we go. It's not a lecture, it's just a discussion. Hopefully we can answer any questions you might have as we go, if anyone's got the courage to ask them. And we'll crack on. So here's our first image of wheelchair fencing. Looks exciting, doesn't it? This was taken from the London Games. But this is kind of sums up wheelchair fencing in a nutshell, really. What's it look like? It looks like this. And I did think about potentially putting some videos on, start the ball rolling, but I realised that when I've done these courses previously online, the sort of lag and the judderiness of it takes away a little bit. So we're going to work on stills more than anything. But fingers crossed, it'll still be just the same. So the first thing we want to talk about is athlete classification. And in general terms, wheelchair fencing competitions are divided up much the same as FIE competitions are. So we have three different weapons and we split on gender. So we have a men's épée and a women's épée, a men's foil and a women's foil. But we also have an additional division and additional classification based on the classification of the athletes, which is kind of around the level of ability and movement each athlete has. If you've ever watched para running at the Paralympics or anything like that, or para swimming, you'll see there's lots of different classifications. Athletes are put into different groups based on their ability to create a level playing field in each group. And wheelchair fencing is no different. So we've got three different classifications. We've still got the weapon and gender class separation. So rather than a World Championships for the FIE, which could have 6 events, 3 weapons and 2 genders, we may have 12 or even 14 events for the wheelchair fencing World Championships, because we'll have a men's foil category A and a men's foil category B, a women's épée category A and a women's épée category B, possibly even a women's épée category C as well, even though there are fewer C athletes. So it's going to be a bit more of a complex situation. We're going to have to talk a little bit about how categories work and whatnot, but in reality, it looks a little bit like this. So the athletes at the top are category A athletes. You can see that they're sitting in their chairs without any strapping, without any kind of official aids or anything. The fences at the bottom are category B fencers, and you can see that a couple of them have had to strap themselves into their wheelchair a little bit. You can tell by looking at the athlete that this athlete doesn't look like he is particularly is a full-time wheelchair user. So it's down to the ability of the athletes. So Class A athletes are kind of the ones which are the most mobile. In general terms, it's a bit fluid, but in general terms, Class A athletes have good trunk stability. They can move backwards and forwards in the wheelchair and they have unimpaired arm movement. So a Class A athlete would be able to move backwards and forwards in their wheelchair using their core stability. If I was fencing a right-handed fence like this, I could move backwards and forwards. I could lunge forwards. I could move backwards. My full range of arm movement. It would be quite. I would be quite mobile. This can include athletes which have got leg amputations or double leg amputations, cerebral palsy, other things. And in reality, it covers, I would say, about 45 to 50% of the wheelchair fencing athletes. There's an athlete at the top there taking a prosthetic leg off before she fences, and there's an athlete at the bottom there. You can see he's a single limb amputee, but he's pretty mobile. He's moving quite agile, as you can see there. Most category athletes tend to be lower limb amputees, but not all. Category B athletes are typically a little less mobile, so it could be that you struggle with your trunk mobility whilst you've still got good arm movement. And for a lot of athletes, this tends to be spinal injuries, but not always. And a category B athlete tends to have to use their other non-fencing arm to help them move in the wheelchair a little bit more. So here you can see a category B athlete. You can see that his legs are strapped a little bit more firmly. He can't move as effectively on his own. And you can see that his backhand is really holding onto the wheelchair. He's having to hold on to the back of the wheelchair to allow him to push and use his backhand to move backwards and forwards. And here's another example, a category B sabre athlete who's having to use the back arm of the wheelchair to push backwards and forwards. I would say that those are about the other 45%. And the last 5 to 10% are category C athletes. These are typically the ones that are the least agile, the ones that are the least mobile, tend to have quite severe impairment of mobility, even to the point of having impaired fencing arm movement. Uh, to the point where even Class C athletes sometimes need their foil or their epee, it tends to be only foil and epee fences, actually bandaged to their hands. So you would see a Category C fencer hold their foil, and then their coach or something would bind it into their hand so that they didn't have to hold it so strongly. So it's really a difficult situation for these athletes. These athletes are so dedicated to fencing that they'll still fence even with the sword bound into their hand. Not an easy picture to see, but the athlete on the left there, you can see his fencing arm doesn't look quite as confident. It's not a brilliant photograph, but you can see that potentially that the foil has been taped into his hand. And at the bottom here is a picture of an athlete, just for interest's sake, that is a quadruple amputee. So this athlete has both limbs, both lower limbs amputated below the knee, and both upper limbs amputated, one below the elbow and one above the elbow, but she is still fencing. She uses a prosthetic hand and fences foil with a prosthesis. And it just goes to show the courage and the passion that some of these athletes have. No matter how difficult life can be, even if you're a quadruple amputee, you can still fence. So let's have a little think about how a fencing competition works for the wheelchair fencers. Now we've talked about the different categories of fencing. We start off with a pool round, just like most standing up events do. However, because the athletes take a little bit longer to get ready and to get prepared for their bouts, each pool is usually held on two pistes. So we have each group of fencers in the pool simultaneously fence on two pistes. So we have athlete number one, number two on piste one, athlete number three and number four on piste two. Just like in standing up fencing, the athletes are grouped into pools of usually seven, but sometimes up to eight athletes, depending on the games. And this first round is done to five touches, just like in the FIE. It's done during country. So here you can see a pool starting off. It's also worth noting that the bout order is different to that in what we would call standing FIE fencing. And the reason for that is because a lot of the time in wheelchair fencing is to do with getting the athletes in and out of the piece. And we'll talk about this later, but the sheer time spent in getting the athletes fixed into the frames means that we have to use a slightly different bout order. And what that means is that one athlete tends to stay on the piste for two consecutive bouts, one after the other. So, for example, bout one might be athlete one and two. For the FIE, bout two would tend to be athlete three and four. But for wheelchair fencing, the next bout would be two and three. So athlete number two would stay on for two matches in a row. The third bout would then be athlete three and four. So athlete number three would stay on for two in a row. So it's just to help with the changeovers and to make sure that the competition runs a little bit more smoothly. Once the pool part of the phase of the competition is done, we go on to a direct elimination, just like for the FIE events. It's based on the ranking from the pools, just like we would expect. We'll go through a last 64, a last 32, a last 8, etc., etc., etc. And occasionally, just as for the FIE, some of the lowest ranked fences are cut after the pool stage just to make the numbers work. That's just as we would expect, just like every other event we're used to. And all DE matches are fenced to 15 touches, so we don't have any junior, any veteran events in wheelchair fencing at the moment. It's just one size fits all at the moment. But here's where we can be different from, in some other ways, from the standing up events. Anyone that's refereed any number of standing up events will know that it's a bit like herding cats. As soon as you finish one match, all the athletes come to you to look at the pool sheet. They ask for the weights. They ask to check the bout order. They're busy working. And the wheelchair athletes do the same thing, but remember that the wheelchair athletes can't get to you quite as easily as the standing up athletes can. So make sure that you announce the order of bouts clearly, enunciate clearly. Some of the athletes have disabilities other than their physical disabilities. They may be deaf or something like that. So if the athlete wants to check the score sheet, be prepared to take it to them on the piste if needs be. And the same thing if you're an FA referee, if you've refereed any kind of standing up FA event, you know that the athletes immediately that they finish their bout, they'll try and steal your weight and your gauges and they'll double check their weapons. Wheelchair athletes are no different, but they'll need to borrow the weights and gauges from you to do it. And most of the wheelchair fencing athletes will keep their bits and pieces quite close to their piece so they can access it easily. If they use a prosthetic, they have to take it off during fencing, but they'll keep it close to their piece. Their drinks bottles, their spare weapons, they'll tend to keep it just near to their wheelchair so they can access it easily. So let them do it. Give them a bit of space to keep their equipment near if they need to. And one thing that is very similar to the FIE is how a match is timed. So just like for standing up fencing, we start the clock when we say alley or play, and we stop the clock when a touch has happened or for any other reason. And just like for the FIE events, fencers are allowed 3 minutes between pool fights or 10 minutes between DE fights. Usually, even though we've talked about the fact that athletes tend to fence two back-to-back matches, this isn't a problem because it takes that long to get the athletes in and out of the frames. Because one athlete fences two back to back, we sometimes have to pause a little while just so they get that full 3 minutes. But in general terms, because the wheelchair fencing athletes know how long it takes them and know what an event is like, they're quite used to it really. So they understand that they get on with it straight away. So here's a standard FIE piece. We've got an FIE box in the middle. We've got an on-guard line. We've got the warning lines. And I think we probably know that it's 40 meters. We know that there's on-guard lines are 2 meters from the center. We've got 3 meters of fencing space. We've got a 2 meter warning line. But for wheelchair fencing, we don't use all this. We still use some of it, and we still use the plates and the sections of the fencing piece, but we only use this center part, the main on guard line plus 2 meters at either side, as well as the on guard lines. So this part here. And the wheelchair fencing frame sits on this, and the rest of the piece isn't used. So in the same space, the 14-meter space that a standard FIE piece is on, we can fit two wheelchair fencing pieces. And that kind of works quite well from the synergy point of view because we talked about the fact that pools are run on two pieces instead of one piece. So in the space that you can run a standing up pool on a 14-meter piece, you can still run a wheelchair fencing pool in the same 14 meters. We just have two back-to-back pieces rather than one long piece. But we talked a little bit there about the frame, and this is the thing that's going to be the first real introduction to the biggest difference between standing up fencing and wheelchair fencing is the wheelchair fencing frame. Now, there are many types of approved frames, and they all look a little bit different, but in reality, they've all got these main points. They've got two plates. These plates are where the wheelchair sits into. So you can imagine that each wheelchair slots into the plate, one at each side. Okay. Sometimes they can be steel, sometimes aluminium, sometimes carbon fiber, sometimes there's a weird checker plate kind of octagonal system. But in reality, they all look more or less the same. They've got a plate for the wheelchair to fit in with a bump at the front, so the front wheels of the wheelchair bump up against it. And they've all got these Y-shaped clamps. So each frame has two Y-shaped clamps at the side. And these Y-shaped clamps clamp on top of the main wheels of the wheelchair, fixing it down towards the plate. There is then a strap at the front, which is a kind of a carabiner type clip on, and it's a very thick, heavy strap that goes around the front wheels of the wheelchair. So we have two Y-shaped clamps on the back wheels, and then a single strap that covers the front two wheels. And some athletes prefer this over their feet or under their feet. It's always good to ask. But in reality, once you've clipped these three things on, the wheelchair is fixed securely in the frame. The two main wheels at the back are clamped down by these, which can be either screw-in or ratchet type fixings, and the two wheels at the front are held down by this strap. And then finally, we have this bar between the two plates. So once we've fixed the two athletes in place, we have to change the distance between the athletes for each match, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But basically, we need to get the athletes to the correct distance to be able to fence. Okay, so this bar holds the two plates together. It holds them in place, but it also, as you can tell, has got a ratchet and essentially a spanner in place that allows you to adjust the distance slightly in and out. Okay, you can see from the weight that sometimes this weighs a lot. The entire setup can vary between 40 to 100 kilos for the entire plate and ratchet system. And so it's worthwhile bearing in mind that if you do ever volunteer to help out at a fencing event, you need to get your Sherpa kind of mentality going because it's quite heavy going. So let's talk a little bit about fences equipment and the biggest difference that a wheelchair fencer will bring to a competition compared to a standing up fencer is clearly the wheelchair. There are some things that are a little bit different about their other kit, but in general terms, a saber fencer who stands up and a saber fencer that sits down will have pretty much the same kit. They'll have the same lame, the same mask, the same glove, the same saber, the same body wire, the same breeches, the same socks if they've got feet. But the biggest difference is the wheelchair itself. And there are a lot of different rules around the wheelchair, and I don't want to go into them in too much detail, but suffice it to say that the height of the wheelchair, the height of the backrest, the height of the side guard, the height of the wheels, the height of the cushion, everything is very tightly prescribed in wheelchair fencing, even towards the angles that the various things have to be set at. But in general terms, it looks a little bit like this. And generally speaking, at a wheelchair fencing event, the wheelchair fencing weapons control will not only check the fencer's clothing and weapons and all the rest of it, but they will check the chairs as well. And just like for standing events which have stickers in the guards or other things like that, the wheelchair fencing event will have stickers on the wheelchair. There'll be one on the wheelchair frame, one on the cushion, one on the backrest. There'll be one on each wheel. There might even be one on the side guard if they've got one. So as you get into wheelchair fencing, you'll start to get used to the idea of not only weapons checking the weights and the gauges on the weapons, but also checking that the wheelchair works fine. Check that they're there. Now, one thing that is common to both weapons but is applied differently is the conformation or the clothing conforming to the rules. Because what British fencing's rules and what the FIE says is that the clothing has to fit the athlete correctly. Now, it might get checked in weapons control, but that doesn't mean to say it fits the athlete perfectly. So we probably all know that if we're refereeing at a standing up event, the athlete has to have their breeches and their jacket overlapping by 10 centimeters, and the glove has to overlap the cuff of the jacket by a certain amount. And all these rules and regulations, which, let's be honest, are very poorly applied in standing up fencing. I'm sure most of us have been to fencing events where you can see people's t-shirts bulging out between the breeches and the jacket and things like that. However, for wheelchair fencing, it's more critical than for standing up fencing, and that's because the two athletes are sat so close together that when they move in their wheelchairs, they sway backwards and forwards, they lunge and they recover and they move out of distance and into distance. They expose the lower part of their body more than a standing up fencer does. And what that means is that they could potentially expose their skin or their t-shirt or whatever they're wearing under their jacket a lot more. Similarly, if you're in foil and sabre, their lame jackets, the same thing. I'm sure we've all seen standing up athletes whose foil lame just doesn't fit at all. It's really important that for wheelchair fencing that the jacket and the lame fit perfectly because most of the hits in wheelchair fencing are done towards the lower part of the body because my biggest defense as a wheelchair fencer is to lean backwards out of the way. And if you can't hit my head or my body, maybe you can hit my hips or my lower torso. So most hits happen on the lower part of the body, which means that the protection around the lower part of the body has to be very precise. The groin strap has to be very tight. The breeches have to be very high. There has to be a good overlap. Okay. And to illustrate this, I took a little photograph from a training session from a UK event here. We've photoshopped it a little bit to make it a little bit more fun. But you can see potentially that there are some issues here. And these are the kind of issues that you might see in standing up fencing, but that are even more critical in wheelchair fencing. So you can see the athlete on the left, when they lunge, because his jacket and his breeches aren't fitted correctly. Can you see how much his torso has been exposed? It's a real risk. We've got hair overlapping jackets. We've got a mask that's not really fitting correctly. And it looks like that might be it. But in reality, there's other things as well. So you can see the groin strap on the fencer on the right isn't quite fitting correctly. It's just a training picture. It's not really a sort of a genuine one. It's done for show more than anything. But you can see the kind of things that we have to look for. We have to make sure that the groin strap's tightened correctly so that the blade doesn't get caught in it. We have to make sure that the athlete isn't showing their skin as they move. Critically important. Okay. Does anyone have any questions on the above before we start to talk about the next part, which is wheelchair fencing, setting distance? Can't hear any, so I'm going to continue. So we've talked about the fact that wheelchair fencing is done at a set distance, and the way this set distance is done is that it is measured between the two athletes depending on the reach of the athletes. So the reach of the athlete is the length of their arm plus the length of their weapon. And the distance between the two athletes is based on the length of the shorter armed athlete's distance. So we have to make sure that the athlete who is shorter, that has shorter reach, can still hit their opponent. Okay. In a nutshell, it's down to that. There are a few nuances amongst it as well, but it's down to that. However, one of the biggest challenges that I've had over the last 10 years in wheelchair fencing, and one of the biggest challenges in wheelchair fencing in general, I feel, is that around personal space issues and respect. So there tends to be a bit of I don't know, it tends to be that wheelchair athletes are treated a little bit differently to FIE athletes. And what I've seen over the years is that sometimes if an athlete isn't sitting correctly or isn't taking the distance correctly or something along those lines, the referee will encourage them by physically grabbing them and moving them into the position that they want them to be in to get the distance correctly. Now, if we can imagine being at an FIE event, if you were a referee at an FIE event and one of the athletes wasn't in the on guard position before starting the match and you walked onto the piste and physically grabbed the athlete and moved them into a correct on guard position, well, they would kill you, wouldn't they? It's completely disrespectful and it's unprofessional. And it's the same thing for wheelchair fencing. We have to treat the wheelchair fencing athletes with complete professional. Most of them are professional athletes. It's really important. So we don't physically assist the athletes in getting in and out of their chairs or the frames unless they ask us to. Most of the athletes you will encounter in wheelchair fencing are professional athletes. They know what they need to do and they know how they do it. You don't need to treat them as if they're any different. It's similar. I don't know. I can't give you too many analogies. It's a bit like being a football referee and going onto the piste and offering to do up the shoelaces of the athletes on the pitch. I mean, why would you do that? So let's be respectful of the athletes. Make sure we treat them with respect. Okay. So what we do is, first thing we do is we check that the athlete is sitting correctly in the center of their wheelchair. Okay. So the jacket for a wheelchair fencer is slightly different to the jacket from a standing up fencer in that it has a stripe down the center of their jacket at the back, a bit like a skunk stripe. It's only an inch wide and it's about 6 inches high, but it's right down the center panel of the athlete's jacket. There is a similar stripe on the back of their wheelchair. Okay. And what we do is we check that the athlete is sitting correctly in the center of their wheelchair by looking at the stripe to make sure the stripe on the spine matches the stripe on the wheelchair. And it's just a way of making sure that the athletes aren't cheating by sitting slightly to one side or slightly to the other side in their wheelchair. Okay. We don't need to touch the athletes to get that they're sitting correctly. What I used to see all the time was a referee would kind of try and pat the athlete to the left or to the right, or would touch their hip to move them to the left or to the right. We don't touch the athletes. We ask them, we say, would you move an inch to your left, please? Would you move 2 centimeters to your right, please? To get them to change position correctly. Please respect the athletes. If, For whatever reason, if an athlete has a disability that means they are physically incapable of achieving the correct on-guard position because they just can't understand or get what you're trying to say, you may indicate what you're saying by assisting them if you ask their permission first. So say to the athlete, okay, we're struggling to get the on-guard position correctly. May I touch your arm to indicate how I need you to sit for this position, please? We need to be respectful to the athletes. Even the volunteers fall foul of this sometimes by trying to be too helpful and trying to be kind of overbearing or whatever. So I took this picture at a competition, an international competition. You can see that the referee is starting to prepare the plate. The volunteer here has grabbed the athlete's hand to hold it up so that we can measure the distance correctly. I mean, how does this athlete feel when a volunteer is grabbing his arm and holding it up in the air to make sure that he can do it correctly? So we don't do it. It's embarrassing and it's demeaning for the athletes. They're professional athletes. We treat them with utter respect and we don't need to manhandle them in place. So let's talk about how we do it in the real world, in ideally, in a perfect situation. So to measure the distance, one fencer holds their weapon horizontally towards the other fencer, as if you're doing a pointing line, if you were doing a standing up kind of event. The second fencer holds their arm so that their point is vertically at the ceiling, with their forearm vertically at the ceiling and their elbow at a right angle. Okay, so point at the opponent and then up in the air so your opponent, so the weapon's at a right angle. What we do is we then check the distance between the two athletes, depending on what weapon is being fenced. If I'm an athlete like that, we check that the other athlete's point is exactly level with my elbow, either on the outside or the inside of my elbow, depending on what weapon we're fencing. Okay, and this is the one time that referees are allowed to touch the athletes, is to check that the weapon is precisely, the tip of the weapon is precisely level with the inside or the outside of the athlete's elbow. Okay, and this is the one area that the athletes expect the referees to physically touch their opponent just very slightly to check that the weapon is level with the elbow. So I've got a photograph here from the London Olympics and a beautiful looking referee there. Don't know who that guy is. But he's checking the distance of a foil match by making sure that the tip of the opponent's foil is exactly level with the outside of the elbow. And he's doing that by putting his hand flat against the opponent's elbow and making sure that he can feel the tip touching the flat of his palm. And this is what it looks like in pictorial sense. So for épée, the distance is set like this. So one athlete, well, both athletes are sat square, perfectly aligned in their seats. Both athletes are looking forward, not at each other. And the reason we make sure that they're looking forwards, not at each other, is because if I stretch my arm out towards my opponent and I start looking at my opponent, you already can see that it's kind of turning my body fractionally and it's really swaying my arm a little bit. And wheelchair fencers will do anything to gain a bit of an advantage. So the fencers look forward. One fencer extends their arm parallel to the ground, completely point in line, and the second fencer extends their arm up. And we check that for épée, the blade reaches the outside of the elbow. So the tip of the opponent's blade as it comes in just reaches the outside of the elbow. The absolute just touches. For foil and for sabre, it's exactly the same. The position is the same. The way that we do the distance is the same, but instead of being the outside of the elbow, it's the inside of the elbow. So in épée, because we're consistently hitting towards the arm and the upper part of the torso, we can have a slightly longer distance, a more tactical match. For foil and for sabre, because it's mostly hitting the body, although there are some hits to sabre in the hand, of course, the athletes are slightly closer together, so it's the inside of the arm. If we referee a category C fencer, which has even more impaired mobility, we sometimes have to bring the distance even slightly closer together again, but that's a different kettle of fish. But this is basically how it works. For épée, the outside of the elbow; for foil and sabre, the inside of the elbow. Now, having said that, the fencers will always try and cheat you a little bit because the distance is so critical to wheelchair fencing. If the shorter arm fencer can bring the other fencer slightly closer, it will help them a lot. Or indeed, if you're the longer arm fencer, getting slightly further away will help you a lot. So what typically happens is that as the referee is trying to get the distance, the athletes will try and cheat a little bit. So they'll tense the shoulder muscles a bit. And what I mean there is I'll put my arm out and I'll tense my shoulder muscles. Just by tensing my shoulder muscles, even imperceptibly, I can bring my arm back in 2 or 3 centimeters to try and get the distance slightly different. Oops. They may also slightly shift in the center of the chair if you don't notice. They might slightly hunch forward or slightly lean back to try and get a little bit of distance. They might not hold the weapon pointing directly at the opponent, but they might hold it slightly off to one side to kind of get a bit of an angle in. So wheelchair fencing athletes have got a load of different ways of trying to cheat the referee just a touch to get an advantage during the distance. It's the hardest thing to make it happen perfectly. It's a real knack. And as we said, the distance between the two fences is based on the person with the shorter reach. But it's always good practice to check for both athletes and confirm with both athletes. So, distance okay for you? Yeah, distance okay for you? Great. And here's a cheerful looking wheelchair athlete who is happy with the distance that I've just taken. She's ready to start fencing. One or two last points on distance. In wheelchair fencing, the equipment that the athlete uses for foil and for sabre is almost identical to standing up fencing, but in for épée, there's one big difference, and which is that the épée athletes wear an apron over their legs. And the reason for that is if we didn't do that, if we allowed the on target to be part of the legs as well, then there wouldn't be much fencing because all the fencing would be down, hit the opponent's legs, which can't move. There'd be no tactical or skill to it. So for wheelchair épée, an insulating apron, and it is lame, just like the foil and saber lames are, is worn from the hips downwards. So that means that only hits from the hips upwards can register a hit in wheelchair épée. But we have to take that off when we take the distance. Okay. Here's an épée bout where they're just getting prepped. And a couple of other things. For standing up fencing, it's not uncommon for an athlete to use a French grip and sometimes hold it at the guard and sometimes hold it at the pommel. Change their grip on their weapon during their fencing. Fine. For wheelchair fencing, you can choose to pommel your French grip, you can choose to hold it near the guard. All of those are fine, but you can't change your grip on the weapon during a bout. So once the distance has been taken, if you hold it at the guard or hold it at the pommel, you then can't change it. The only time we can change the distance is if one of the frame parts slips or one of the wheelchairs becomes dislodged from the frame. Now, it doesn't happen so often, but it happens maybe one time in 5 or 6 bouts, especially if the athletes are really, really dynamic. One of the clips holding the wheelchair in place on the frame might come off, in which case we have to refix it and we just have to double check that the distance hasn't changed at all. You can probably tell that this photograph was here taken from the Tokyo Olympics. There's nobody in the crowd. Everyone's wearing face masks, even the athletes. Crazy times, eh? So, has anyone got any questions on setting the distance before we move on to hand signals and some other things?
So what do you do if you find someone's trying to keep the distance?
So what we do is we correct them. We say to them, you're leaning backwards slightly, please sit upwards. You're leaning to the left slightly, please sit upwards. And we don't continue until the athlete has continually achieved the position we want. If we feel that the athlete is deliberately cheating the distance and is not conforming to our requests, then we just do like we do with every other penalty, we give them a yellow card. That usually sorts the matter out. However, if they continue, and I've seen that happen a dozen or so times, it's not uncommon. I mean, it's not that common, but it's not uncommon. If they continue to try and play with the distance, then you do the same thing. You give them a second Group 1 penalty, which is a red card, and the match starts at 1-0 down. And believe me, they pretty quickly get into the right position after that. I've only ever seen that once or twice. Most athletes will play the game a little bit, but if you catch them out, they'll be honest. If you have to penalise them with a yellow card, they'll certainly be honest after that.
Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about hand signals and refereeing in general. So there are, just like for standing fencing, there are a number of hand signals, okay? And it's really important to use good hand signals to be able to show the fencers what you saw and to sort of the athletes and the coaches, the spectators, the crowds, whatever, so you can explain what you can see. However, as you might have seen from some of the pictures earlier on, the referees tend to be sat down just like the athletes are. So everyone's at the same level. So the two athletes are in wheelchairs and the referees sat down in a chair to referee. And what that means is that even though the hand signals are essentially the same, we have to adapt them very slightly. We also have to adapt more to the fact that one athlete is typically facing the referee and the other athlete is typically facing away. For standing up refereeing, both athletes are on the piste, and yes, one is facing one direction and one is facing the other direction a little bit, but the angle that the fencers are stood at is such that both athletes can tend to see the referee clearly. For wheelchair fencing, because the frame is at a 23-degree angle, and when we've got one athlete left, excuse me, both athletes the same hand, one athlete almost can't see the referee. They really have to look almost over their shoulder to see the referee clearly. So we have to adapt our hand signals a little bit for that as well. Okay. So the hand signals need to be clear, they need to be large, they need to be obvious. We need to demonstrate that we understand what happened with the hit. And just like for FIE refereeing, we just do it clearly at one side or the other. So we say tap from the right is no, tap from the left is parrot. So we're very clear and open with it. Okay. And generally speaking, the slower the better. Now, anyone that's ever refereed standing up fencing will know that after a hit has been given, the referee is awarded a hit for whatever it is, tap, parry, post, whatever it is, the athletes never get back on guard immediately. They walk back to the end of the piece, they fiddle with the socks, they play with the spool a moment, they kind of decompress for a few seconds just to get back into the zone. Wheelchair athletes are no different. So given that, but they can't walk to the back of the piece, they can't fiddle with the spool, they can't do all the other stuff that the standing up athletes can do. So give the athletes a few seconds between touches to mentally decompress a little bit. And part of the way we can do that is to do our phrasing very slow. So instead of, for example, in the FIE, we might see attack from the right, parry, across touche. The entire phrase was done in less than a second. What we might see for wheelchair fencing is attack from the right. It's initially parried. Riposte is touche, point for the left. And instead of doing the entire phrase in 1 second, we might do it in 4 or 5 seconds. It's a little bit slower and a little bit clearer, just to give the athletes time to mentally decompress, ready for the next bout. Okay. Just like starting a touch for standing up fencing, we do 3 phases. We do en garde as an order, we do ready or prêt as a question, and then we do aller or fence as an order. And the hand signals are broadly the same. However, for wheelchair fencing, because the athletes are so close, really anticipating the play, anticipating the word aller can be a massive advantage to the fencers. And for referees that have the same cadence over and over and over again, what you see is the athletes try to guess when the referee will say play, because that fraction of a second can make all the difference, especially in wheelchair sabre. Less so in épée, moderately so in foil, but in wheelchair sabre, because the athletes are so close, initiating an attack a millisecond before the other guy or lady will be enough to get you a touch. So anticipating the alley is a real big problem. So the referee has to vary the cadence of their matches much more than he would in standing up fencing. So I would say on guard. Ready? Play. And then in the next hit, I would go on guard. Ready? Play. The next hit, I would go on guard. Ready? Play. We vary the cadence so the athletes can't predict when we're going to say play, just to avoid that advantage. And the hand signals are just the same as they are for standing up fencing. So on guard, hands down to the side. Ready? Hands to the side. And then play or alley, hands inwards. But because one athlete can see us very clearly and the other one can't, we don't give that athlete an advantage with our hands at the play. So the recommendation for wheelchair referees is that we don't do this hand action until a second or two after the match has started. So for standing up fencing, I would go on guard. Ready? Play. And I would bring my hands together exactly when I say play. For wheelchair fencing, I would say on guard. Ready? Play. And then I would do it a second or so after the match has started, just so that one athlete doesn't get an advantage over the other athlete. And we just touched on this, but it's critical because in wheelchair fencing, the distance is so tight that starting early is a big advantage. And I once did a calculation that on average, you give more yellow cards for starting early than, sorry, more yellow cards for starting early than 4 times all the other cards added up together in a match. So starting early is by far the most common, by like I say, 4 times more common than any other card. Okay. And it's so common that the wheelchair athletes are so used to it. They understand that they will get yellow cards. They understand that they will get red cards. They understand that they'll get a second red card, a third red card. I've had bouts where I've watched the athletes get three, four, five red cards in a bout because of starting early, and they always acknowledge it. They go, "Yep, started early, started early." I've seen literally dozens of matches finish with a red card due to an athlete starting early, and it's such a common thing. So be aware that it is really part of wheelchair fencing refereeing, but it can be quite difficult sometimes to see who started early. So just like for the FIE, tiny changes in body posture or hand posture can initiate something bigger, but it's not always easy to see. So it's not always the athlete that does this big attack that started early. It could be this athlete that twitched a little bit that made them go. Okay. And certainly we can give cards to both fences. Now, a bit later on in the talk, we'll talk a little bit about athlete disabilities and how that might impact starting early. But in general terms, it's always required to, there's no kind of, let's say, get out of jail card. For standing up fencers, occasionally you'll see referees, if one athlete starts a little bit early, they'll give them a verbal warning, especially in sabre, they'll say, oh, back on guard, and they won't give them a yellow card immediately. They'll just give them some sort of crazy verbal warning that is not in the rules because they think it's more kind of, I don't know, appropriate. For wheelchair fencing, there is none of that. If you start early, you get a yellow card or a red card. That's it. So that brings us on neatly to penalties. And just like for standing up fencing, there are 3 types of cards. There's a yellow, a red, and a black. And for standing up fencing at the moment, we have 6 cards, don't we? Because we have a yellow, a red, and a black, and a yellow P, a red P, and a black P. Thankfully for wheelchair fencing, it's slightly old-fashioned, or back in the let's call it the good old days. We still only have 3 cards, a yellow, a red, and a black. And these are just as they are for FIE fencing, a warning, a point, and exclusion. And just like they are for FIE fencing, we've got 4 groups, Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, Group 4. And anyone that's familiar with standing up fencing will understand how these penalty groups work. Fairly straightforward. Just like for standing up fencing, if you come to the piece with non-conforming equipment, if your foil fails the test weight or whatever, that's a Group 1 yellow. If you come with, just like we confiscate it, just like we would for FIE. And we do the same thing over and over again, just like for the FIE. So if you have multiple weapons that fail, then we get a yellow card followed by red cards, just like we would expect. So no change there. Okay. But what we did say was that starting early is going to be the most common thing. So don't be afraid to give the yellow cards. And it's fairly common for a fencer to get a yellow card for a weapon failure, followed by an initial red card for starting early one time. You would see it. Okay. What we talked about briefly was athlete disabilities, and starting early in the match is always a yellow card offence, except if it's initiated by a results of an athlete's disability. And the only time this usually happens is for category B athletes whose spinal injury makes them have uncontrolled leg tremors or leg spasms. So some athletes have an uncontrolled leg spasm. Okay, so they can be sat perfectly on guard, they can be ready to fence, and one leg will start to spasm, which is technically starting early because you're moving before the word alley. But if it's due to your disability, if the leg spasm is part of your disability or part of your classification, then that would not count as a starting early event. Now, typically, you can tell the difference because a leg spasm or something tends to be a very obvious event, whereas starting to fence early, which is lunging or moving the hand or whatever, tends to be a very clear intent of fencing. So you can usually tell the difference very clearly. And we said it's possible to give cards to both fencers, and it's very common for fencers to receive multiple cards very often. Now, if we have to do a card during a match, just like for FIA events, like covering the Valley Target or something like that, we should annul the hit if it's done during a bout. And we have to continually write down what the cards are on the score sheet, just like we would normally. And cards, just like for the FA, are commutative. So if you have a yellow card, then it's always a red card next. And the Group 1 and Group 2 offences last for one match, and Group 2, Group 3, and Group 4 offences last for the entire event. Okay, so that's very similar. One thing that is similar but different is ducking the head. So anyone that's refereed a standing up event will occasionally have had issues with athletes ducking. moving their head downwards so that the top of their head faces towards their opponent. In wheelchair fencing, as you can imagine, because you're seated, it's a real problem. So I'm an athlete, I'm fencing an athlete over there. I can lunge backwards and forwards, I can move, I can lunge, I can move. But if I lunge and duck my head towards my opponent, then I've actually covered my target area and I've also put myself at risk. And so that is a group one offence. And you can generally tell by the angle of the spine and the head for the wheelchair athlete. So here's a wheelchair athlete sat in his wheelchair. He's lunging forwards at the opponent. His head is upright. He's looking at his opponent. Totally fine. Down here is a wheelchair athlete who is actually trying to gain a bit of extra distance by lunging forwards with his head and pushing forwards. Not fine. Okay. So check that the athlete's spine and head are aligned just for safety points of view. Now, ooh. Um, Passivity is something we briefly touched on, but passivity in wheelchair fencing is very different from passivity in standing up fencing. Okay. For a start, there are two types of passivity in wheelchair fencing. There is one-sided passivity and there is two-sided passivity. All passivity in standing up fencing is two-sided passivity. Both athletes are unwilling to fence or have not fenced for 15 seconds, for 1 minute, sorry. I've not scored a point for 1 minute. In wheelchair fencing, because the athletes are fixed at a distance apart from each other, it is plausible that one athlete can get so far out of distance that even no matter how much the other athlete tries, they can't hit them. So I'm a right-handed fencer, I'm fencing my opponent over there. If I lean so far back out of distance that my opponent can't hit me, then I could potentially spend an entire 3 minute match out of distance and my opponent couldn't hit me. So if I score the first hit, I could lean back for 2 minutes and 55 seconds and nothing would happen. So we have a rule that says athletes are allowed to move backwards and forwards. They're allowed to lunge forwards, backwards, allowed to move with distance. They're allowed to distance parry just like every other event. But you're not allowed to stay back behind your on guard position for more than 15 seconds. You have to come back up at least level once every 15 seconds before going backwards. And here's a picture of some athletes doing it. So you can see the athlete on the left here is really leaning back out of distance. The athlete on the right is trying their absolute very best to reach them, but the athlete on the left is leaning back so far that clearly they just can't reach them. So 15 seconds of this, the referee would call halt. They would give a yellow card or a red card, depending on which event, which number of offence it was, whether it was the first or second offence. And the fencer on the left would be penalised for it. You usually only see it when fencers are leading the bout. So if I'm three hits up in a DE match and there's only a minute left, it's a valid tactic to sit back for a bit because I can get 15 seconds off the clock. And even though I'll get a yellow card and maybe even a red card for my next 15 seconds, I'm really kind of pushing down the timing. But it's something that referees have to keep an eye on, this 15 seconds of passivity. And it resets if the athlete gets back up. So here's my on-guard position with my body and my spine straight in my chair. I'm fencing, fencing, fencing. I can lunge forwards, lunge backwards, no problem. Lunge forwards, lunge backwards, take a parry, do whatever I want. I can go back out of distance, that's fine. I can wait, I can wait, I can wait. I can bob backwards and forwards, but I'm still not in my on-guard position. I have to come back up to at least on guard and then back again. So it gives the opponent at least one chance to hit me and back again. If I stay back and I just bob a little bit forwards and backwards, it doesn't count. I'm still not on guard. I'm still not on guard. I'm on guard now and then back in. So I need to come back up to on guard at least once every 15 seconds to avoid this penalty. Okay. It's common. You see this a lot, especially in epee and especially in matches where one fencer is significantly higher than the other one. One-sided passivity. There is also two-sided passivity, and this is like the old FIE rule. So it's not passivity in the sense that current passivity is, which is P yellow, P red, etc., etc. It's the old style FIE rule. The wheelchair fencing rules haven't caught up. So it applies to direct elimination and team matches only, and it's when both athletes either lean back out of distance or no hit is scored for 1 minute. Okay, it's very rare. The only time you ever see it typically is in epee matches. I've never seen it in sabre matches in 20 years of refereeing, and I've only ever seen it once or twice in foil matches, and that tends to be when there are hit after hit after hit after hit after hit, but they're all off target and there isn't a valid touch. And in this instance, if anyone remembers the old FIE rules, what we do is we finish the period, we just move immediately on to the next period of fencing. Okay. But it's not that common, but it is two-sided passivity. So just have to be clear that there is one-sided passivity, which is quite common, and two-sided passivity, which is less common. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about side judges or assessors. Okay. So we mentioned for FIE events, you occasionally see the referees at the side of the piece looking like plant pots or cactuses. They stand there, they watch the match, but they don't really do much. The main referee's doing all the judging. The two side referees just stand there, stare in space, and they get the podium. In wheelchair fencing, it's very different. Okay. In wheelchair fencing, side judges are used a lot. In fact, they're used from last eight onwards, obligatory, but often even before that. And in fact, wheelchair fencing athletes commonly ask for side judges for their match. So if I'm a wheelchair fencing judge and I believe that my opponent is breaking one of the rules of fencing, and we'll talk about the lifting rule in particular, then I can ask for side judges, and the delegation will always try and give you side judges. Okay, so it's much more common in wheelchair fencing. They can help the main referee with setting the distance, but generally speaking, their main job is to look at the athlete's, for want of a better word, backside. Okay? There is a rule in wheelchair fencing that one of the athlete's buttocks has to remain on the cushion at all times. So that means I'm sat on my cushion at the moment in my wheelchair, both my buttocks are touching it. I can lean forwards. One of my buttocks is up in the air, the other one is still touching. Fine. I can lean all the way backwards. My left butt is still touching, my right is up in the air. Fine. But if I go up and all the way out, so I use my legs to jump up, neither of my buttocks is touching the chair, that's a penalty. Okay? And the outside judge's job is to check that the athletes aren't leaving the wheelchair. So here's a photograph I took from an event a couple of years ago. Both athletes have lifted from the wheelchair. The athlete on the left, who is out of picture, has leaned so far backwards that he's almost falling over the back of his wheelchair. And even though the strap is holding him in place from falling out, both his buttocks are up above the wheelchair. They're like 2 or 3 inches above the chair because he's leaned so far backwards. The athlete on the right has almost done the same thing in reverse. He's almost stood up to the point where he's left the wheelchair. You can see how far off he is. He's practically off the wheelchair. He's moved so much. So the side judges, their job is to make sure that the athletes stay in contact with the wheelchair base, with the cushion. Okay. So what we have to do is we have to ask ourselves continuously, have the fencers lifted their buttocks off the wheelchair? Have they adjusted their seat position by sliding left and right in the chair, or have they slid over and onto the wheel a bit? Has the wheelchair fencer used their legs? Some athletes are so strong with their legs, even though they're a wheelchair user, they can use their legs to jump in the air a little bit, and they can propel themselves up towards their opponent. So they leave the wheelchair cushion for a split second. And in all instances, the side judges bring that to the attention of the referee, and any hit that's scored that way is annulled. So if I jump at my opponent and hit them, but I've left the wheelchair while I do it, the side judge will put the hand up, will say the athlete lifted from the chair, my hit will be annulled, and I will get a yellow card for lifting, which is a Group 1 offence. Now, these side judges can position themselves wherever they think it's easiest to see this. Okay. So sometimes each side judge has to watch one athlete, but you can choose whether you watch the athlete closer to you or the athlete furthest away from you, depending on how you think the athlete is likely to be leaving the cushion. So here we have a side judge watching the athlete from the back because he thinks that the athlete might jump forwards. And so he's trying to check whether the athlete is still in contact with the cushion from the side. Here is a side judge watching the athlete from the front. So he's making sure that the athlete isn't jumping up going backwards. He's trying to look under the athlete from the front. So we can have the athletes checked from either behind or front. You can even have situations where, depending on the athletes, both side judges are at the same side of the piste, but one is looking at the back of the front of the athlete nearest, and one is looking at the front of the athlete across there. Whatever is important to be able to check that the athletes aren't leaving leaving the cushion. And we have to do other things as well. We have to make sure that the body wire hasn't been unclipped. It's much more common in wheelchair fencing than it is in standing up fencing for the wheelchair to for the athlete's body wire to kind of get snagged up and clip and come off. Especially when you're moving backwards and forwards, you've got the clip coming down, it's attached to your lame at the bottom, but you're moving backwards and forwards in your wheelchair, backwards, forwards. It's not uncommon for that wheelchair to catch the body wire and unclip it slightly. It's very common for the athletes to take their feet off the footrest to try and cheat and gain an advantage. Mass clips come off just the way they do in standing up foil and sabre. The apron might not cover the wheelchair correctly in wheelchair fencing pace, so that's worthwhile checking. Sometimes the wires of the spool might get caught underneath the frame, or the entire frame might slide a little bit on the piste and need readjustment. In wheelchair fencing, it's often considered that the side judge's job can be equal, if not more, difficult than the main referee's job. In standing up fencing, I think everyone would agree that the main job referee has the tough job and the side judges have quite an easy job, relatively speaking. For wheelchair fencing, it's much harder. And if you're in a wheelchair fencing match fencing épée, for example, so you don't have to do any phrasing of hits, the centre judge has a relatively easy job compared to the side judges who have to do a lot of difficult things. And the last thing we were going to talk about was medical breaks. And I thought we would do this as a bit of a quiz, but we're running short on time, so I'm just going to go through it anyway. Um, just like for the FIE events, if a fence is injured, we have to call people. We have to call the doctor. We have to call the DT. But there are a few different things that apply to wheelchair fencing. So. Wheelchair fencing, the athletes still have 10 minutes from when they drop to ground permission. For FIE now, for standing up fencing, it's 5 minutes, but for wheelchair fencing, it's still 10 minutes, okay? And just like for the FIE, the doctor has to give their approval, but there's one big difference, okay? Almost every athlete, well, technically, I suppose it has to be, every single athlete at a wheelchair fencing event already has a pre-existing medical condition of one sort or another, whether that be an amputation, a spinal injury, cerebral palsy, who knows. But to qualify as a wheelchair fencing athlete, you have to have some form of physical disability to qualify. That means that an injury, it's really hard to identify whether an injury is genuinely due to fencing or whether it's part of your disability. But two standing up athletes, if one offender says, "Oh, I've got this bad back or a shoulder injury or something," the doctor can usually tell whether it's part of from fencing or not. But if you're a doctor at an event and you go to a piste and there's an athlete who has a pre-existing spinal injury and is a permanent wheelchair user, and then tells you that they've got a spinal pain and that it's due to fencing, I mean, you're a brave doctor that says that it can't be due to the athlete's pre-existing disability and that it's due to the wheelchair fencing kind of injury. So, in general terms, this is one area where the rules are very lax in wheelchair fencing. If there's an injury on the piste, the athlete is usually given as long as they need to recover from it, even if it takes longer than 10 minutes. And the other athlete never, in my experience, never presses for this time because they know at some point in the future it'll be them that needs the break. So, for example, an athlete that has an uncontrolled leg spasm for a few minutes, the other athlete won't be like, "Come on, get on with it, get on with it," tapping the watch and all the rest of it. They'll be, "Yeah, no problem, take as long as you want," because next week it could be me. Some athletes with CP or other things might need longer for dehydration, shakes, or things like that. And the athlete that I showed you a picture of before, who is a quadruple amputee, she occasionally has issues with her prosthetic arm that need essentially taking off and refitting back on again, which can take a full 10 minutes. But other athletes are really, really relaxed about it. So this is one area where the wheelchair fencing is much more relaxed than standing up fencing. And that was my last slide. How exciting is that? I managed to get through the entire deck in, oh, exactly an hour. Perfect. Thank you so much.